Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Grass and mud-walled villages burn, ill-clad villagers bleed and die in Southeast Asia. It is, for someone of my age at least, a very familiar sight. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, even Korea are part of the soundtrack of my life.
Those who don't die are forced to flee, on foot through the landmines or afloat on the unforgiving sea, with their children on their backs, if they're lucky.
I call it Burma, you may call it Myanmar. I called it Cambodia, you may call it Kampuchea. Either way, we have been faced for years, not weeks, with an actual as opposed to a rhetorical genocide. An attempt to destroy completely a specific category of people, namely the Rohingya.
68% of the Burmese people are ethnically Burma. The name Myanmar is contested as a name imposed by the military dictatorship, which has effectively been in power since 1962. 87% of the population are Buddhist. The military dictatorship has long repressed the minorities in the state in the name of ethno-religious supremacy.
The former darling of Western liberals, Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi, is the country's political leader, the lipstick on the pig of the still ruling military junta. So, we have a genocide taking place in a Buddhist country led by a Nobel laureate. You couldn't make it up. To help untangle what's going on now is our first guest, filmmaker Shafiur Rahman, who has just returned from the front line in Bangladesh. Welcome to the Sputnik, Shafiur. Where have you just been and what did you find there?
Thanks, George. I'm happy to be here. I've been all along the border with Myanmar on the Bangladesh side. You've seen scenes on television, but really to be there, it's quite an overwhelming experience. You see thousands and thousands of people, mainly women and children, sitting in the torrential rain, sitting in the sun, without very little shelter. They're exhausted. They're having to struggle in the mud. They can't feed the children properly. The women are unable to lactate. They can't breastfeed. And sometimes you get panic, you get pandemonium. I was there on the Gundum border, and suddenly we heard that 2 people had been shot dead, 2 Rohingya refugees trying to come into Bangladesh. And there was howling and crying all around. And I filmed these refugees trying to retrieve the bodies from the no man's land, slipping all over in the mud, blood everywhere. It's absolutely terrible.
Now, you say it's mainly women and children, which begs the obvious question, what's happened to the men?
I think the onslaught of the Burmese military hasn't spared men, women or children. From all the stories that we've heard, no one has been left in certain villages. Women have been targeted. Women have been targeted for rape. Women have been targeted. They've been corralled into huts and torched. Men have often fled to the villages, to the hills, just before the attacks become known. But the presence of so overwhelming numbers of women as opposed to men does beg the question, where are they?
This didn't start weeks ago, although the TV cameras showed up weeks ago. It started years ago. It's important, I think, for viewers to know that. This is not some response to a specific event or some act of resistance by the Rohingya people. This is a process over years of attrition to ethnically cleanse Burma of its Rohingya population, isn't it?
Yes, I think the bogeyman of the jihadi, the Islamic extremists, they would like to say that Rohingya is a very convenient handle for the Burmese military. But as you have said, the process has been extended. The violence really kicked off in 1978 when you saw the first large population movements from Burma into Bangladesh. I've been filming this year, and there have been numerous instances of villages being torched, or people being raped, or people being killed. These episodes provide a very welcome and convenient handle for the military to go in and, if you like, expedite their task.
Is it the case that vigilante militants make the first attacks and then the army moves in?
Not necessarily. We've heard of villages where the army have surrounded the villages, and Rakhine mobs, sometimes even monks, are part and parcel of the process of killing people.
Actually killing them, the monks?
Yes, I think there's even documented evidence from 2012 where these people are involved. Let me give you an example of one particular village which seems to exemplify what's happening across this Rakhine state. The village was surrounded by the army. They were told, the Rakhine chairman told everyone, look, we're going to torch your buildings, we're going to torch your homes, but we're not going to harm you, so please assemble. They pointed out a place for them to assemble. But soon there was a realization that this is not what was going to happen. They torched the place, and then they set upon the people. And what happened there was quite astonishing. Over a period of 3 days, virtually every member of that village was slaughtered, was killed somehow, men, women, and children.
Now, this comes as a great shock to people, even perspicacious viewers of Sputnik. Monks, Buddhists, both of whom have a kind of idealized image in Western countries. The Dalai Lama and chanting in front of the Buddha and so on. It's quite a shock to people. Is it a shock to you? Is it a shock to the victims?
I think those who follow the process of what's been happening to the Rohingya, I think it's not entirely a shock, and it's a very crafted thing that's happening here. It's often seen in the press as a communal conflict, as a religious conflict. It's not quite that. It's a very useful angle to have for the military to put it like that. I think if you see that one of the real questions is about land grabbing, is about resources in that area, it's become a very interesting area for corporate agriculture, timber, geothermal projects, and so on. And land grabbing has also affected the Buddhist smallholders. So if you think about it, it's very useful for the military to set one group up against another in order to hide the economic and their business interests that they have, which is affecting both population groups. Of course, one population group is being targeted as particularly unpalatable aliens, as in the Rohingya. But it's not to say that Buddhists haven't been affected also by the military's business interests in the region.
But the ideological base of the regime is Burmese nationalism, Buddhist chauvinism. Other groups over decades have been repressed, the Karen people, the Mon people, who are all small minorities in the state. One after the other have, or often something at the same time, have been targeted. So the main driver, isn't it, is the ethno-religious attempt to make Burma an entirely Burmese, an entirely Buddhist country.
There's no doubt about it that there's an ethnic component to this and that there's a communalist component to this. The terms that are used to discriminate against Rohingya, Kalar and so on, they are ethno slurs, if you like, which target darker-skinned people, which target Muslims. Without a doubt, that's the case. But it's undeniable also that the military have very specific business interests, and hand in hand, it's a very potent mix.
Can I just go back to the border where you have been going and filming for a good year now? So mostly women and children. I think over 250,000 have now fled into Bangladesh. So what is happening to them? Well, where are they? Is the Bangladeshi government just keeping them there, or is there a certain program around it?
I think at first it was the idea of containment, that people would be somehow pushed back into Burma when things calmed down. But that idea soon evaporated because things weren't calming down as the villages kept being torched. So now they're being slowly released from those areas, and they're coming into an already very tight situation. All the camps are completely over capacity already. So you can imagine the arrival of 370, now I believe the figure is 390,000. So you can imagine what the impact of 390,000 people will do. You can think about latrines, you can think about food distribution, you can think about even to erect a small hut for yourself or just a plastic sheet over your head is a very difficult task if you're an unaccompanied child or if you're a mother with lots of children and you don't have any money to buy the plastic. Oh. There's no one providing you with money or giving you plastic sheets. There's a flourishing market in plastics, which I just cannot believe how this can be.
Lastly, I'm afraid we're running out of time. The British government is still providing military training to the Burmese military that is carrying out these atrocities. How does that make you feel?
I read today that John McCain is going to introduce an amendment to the American bill. And this is John McCain, someone who is a Republican and someone you don't really feel that might engage in progressive policies. And yet here we are in the UK, still going along as if nothing has happened.
It's deeply repugnant, of course. I'm really grateful to you for your first-hand testimony. I wish we had more time to explore it further, maybe on another occasion. Shafiur Rahman, God bless your work and thanks for coming on the Sputnik.
Thank you very much.
Coming up next, the elections in Germany, where there's no Russian interference after all. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Next week's federal elections in Germany will determine not just the governance of Europe's most important country, but will shape the next stage in the history of the European Union and the flow of migrants and refugees into the European continent, and will also be pivotal in determining Britain's relations with Europe once we leave the EU. So important then. Our resident expert in European affairs is, of course, Dr. Russell Foster from King's College London, and we're very glad to say he's joined us again now. Dr. Russell, we never tire of seeing you, in any case, but there's an election, it seems, every other month in Europe, and a cataclysmic event can always be counted on in between. So this is a biggie, the German election. How's it looking?
Well, I would definitely agree that this is the big election in this year of elections that we've been dealing with. It hasn't ended, of course. We've got 4 elections coming up in Europe in the next few months, but all eyes have been on the German one because, as we all know, the European Union is dependent upon German support. Now, in contrast to the Dutch, the British and the French elections, which were in the media because they were quite touch and go as to whether populists would get in, the German election has been very quiet and quite calm.
Unbelievably quiet. You can't find anything about it almost.
It's astonishing. You have to dig quite deep.
Yeah.
Now, the reason for this is that Angela Merkel is all but guaranteed to become Chancellor for a 4th term in the elections next week. The Christian Democratic Union will win most of the seats in the Bundestag, which will give them a great deal of control, but as is always the case in post-war German politics, they'll have to form a coalition with one of the other major parties. Now, this is significant because in the upcoming elections, we may see the number of parties in the Bundestag rising from 4 to 6, with the election of representatives for Die Linke or the Greens, or possibly Alternative for Deutschland.
That's the right wing.
Well, we will call them right wing, but a little bit like Front National or the PVV in the Netherlands, they absorb voters from across the political spectrum. Now, Merkel has got essentially 2 choices as to who she forms a coalition with. The first one is the SPD under Martin Schulz, who experienced quite a surge in popularity a little while ago. They're already in coalition with the CDU, and their outlook upon Europe will be very significant in determining Germany's relations with other members of the Union after the elections. But another alternative is that she could form a coalition with the Free Democratic Party, the FDP, who she was in office with prior to 2000.
And then they fell below the threshold.
They did. They were wiped out in 2013, partly because of how they had dealt with financial regulation in Germany. But Merkel's CDU has been in government with both the SPD and the FDP at different points. But each party has very, very different views of how the European Union should be structured and what reforms need to take place in Europe. So, although Merkel is going to win the election and it will be business as usual in Germany, depending on who she forms a coalition with will send Europe in one of two very different directions.
It's perilous for the SPD, which is the Labour Party equivalent, to be in a coalition government with the Tories. It would be like Jeremy Corbyn sitting in Theresa May's cabinet in a junior position.
It sounds strange to us, but this is quite the norm for Germany, that they provide
Europe in general,
exactly, that they provide a stable, systematic government. Now, the CDU is not really the equivalent of the Tories. They're probably closer to right-wing Liberal Democrats. They're much more centrist. But with the SPD, we could possibly see a continuation of what we saw in the Netherlands, in France, and in the British local elections before our general election, in which the establishment left wing was annihilated. I don't think that the SPD is going to be wiped out, but they may take quite a tumble.
But they have taken an establishment turn. I mean, Schulz, if he'd been smart, would have taken a Corbyn turn. He would have left Merkel's coalition. He would have struck out on his own with a bold, real Labour platform. But he's done the opposite.
Well, this is one problem for the SPD, that many of their priorities and policies are not that indistinguishable from the CDU. This means it's very easy for them to form a coalition, but it also begs the question of why should somebody vote SPD instead of CDU? There's also the problem that Schulz is not very good at managing his own image as a politician. He is still seen as the arch-Eurocrat, the man who promised to fight corruption and nepotism in the European Parliament and then essentially got in through backdoor practices.
This brings me to Die Linke, which, if you like, is a Corbynite party, basically standing for the same things that Labour under Corbyn does here. They have a charismatic leader. How do you think they're likely to do?
I think they might get one seat, but it's debatable whether they'll even achieve that, because although Die Linke's policies are quite similar to those that we see under Corbyn's Labour, Die Linke still has a lot of residual connection with the old communists of East Germany. So they will gain some support in areas, in old, overlooked, post-industrial areas of East Germany. But because of the continuation, the legacy of the communists, they're not likely to do very well. And another problem is that a lot of the people who might have voted for Die Linke are flocking to Alternative for Deutschland. So if there was, if there was no AFD, Die Linke would probably get a couple of seats. But the AFD, just like the Front National in France or UKIP in the United Kingdom, have appealed to and swept up a large part of the vote from the old industrial working class, who feel ignored and isolated by a distant metropolitan elite which is not interested in their concerns.
Well, this concept was invented in Germany in one sense. I don't want to go too deeply into the phenomenon of Strasserism, but the Nazi Party itself had a left wing around Strasser. They were butchered, all of them, in the Night of the Long Knives. But their stance was both right wing and left wing exactly the same time. The Front National in France has indeed modelled itself on that. And from what you say, so has the AFD. Tell us more.
Well, this is one of the characteristics of populism that we're seeing in Europe and the United States today, of a continuation of early 20th century policies which are designed to appeal to people who feel ignored by an establishment class. So we can't categorise them as left or right wing. Now, the AFD is potentially unique in European populists. One reason is Germany's collective memory. In Britain, in America, in France, we haven't really faced up to the atrocities that we committed in our imperial eras. But but in Germany, everyone is very aware of the consequences of populism. Another problem for the AfD is that they have shifted their rhetoric quite significantly. When the AfD was founded, it was appealing to people who didn't like Germany.
Recently? Or when was that?
It was a few years back.
Yeah, so they're quite new party,
They're relatively new, but like a lot of the populists that we're seeing, but they were founded in order to appeal to people who didn't like German money going to bail out the Greeks. And it was essentially a party formed around opposition to an undemocratic European Union and a financial structure which they felt was disadvantaging Germans. But recently, the AfD's priorities have shifted a lot. They're no longer financial skeptics, they're now ethnic Eurosceptics and appealing to an ethnic Germanness which is defined against the million migrants who came in under Merkel's policy. Now, this means that the AfD have lost quite a lot of support precisely because of the German collective memory that they remember what happens when you blame all of your problems on one group.
Well, let's hope so. On the other hand, if that's not what happens, if they do well, that's bound to impact on the German state's attitude to what, by anybody's standards, has been a massive influx of migrants and refugees.
And we've already seen that Merkel's stance on refugees has changed very significantly. So just like Mark Rutte in the Netherlands, just like Theresa May in the United Kingdom, we're going to see the same thing in Germany of establishment parties which are maintaining their power by adopting some of the nationalist rhetoric and discourse. So at the height of the refugee crisis, Merkel said, come to Germany with open arms. Then, less than a year later, she's publicly debating whether the burqa should be banned in some places to appeal to people who otherwise would vote for the AfD. But regardless of how many seats the AfD win, they might win a few, but not many. It's not going to impact the coalition's policies because everyone has ruled out a deal with the AfD. So the coming coalition between the CDU and either the SPD or the FDP will be significant, depending on which one it is. If the SDP come in, we're going to see demands for more European integration, greater reform of Europe and an extension of the Eurozone to include all EU members.
I think that's a given. There's only time for one more question, but I do want to hear your answer to it. There was all this babble that Russia was interfering in the German elections. That's now largely debunked, I think, but you can tell me if it isn't. Will the new German government take a different approach to, for example, sanctions against Russia than Merkel has been forced to take by the US until now?
Again, it depends. If it's the SDP, then we'll see Germany's policy towards Russia remaining much the same. If it's the FDP, their leader has pushed for Germany to accept Crimea's admission into the Russian Federation, and we'll see a détente of German-Russian relations. This issue of hacking, it's something that seems to crop up in every election, and the Germans have a remarkably insecure system for collating votes at the local level to the federal level. So expect to see more accusations of Russian interference in an antiquated system.
Dr. Foster, your students are lucky to have you. You distill all of these issues down so perfectly.
Dankeschön.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So we asked whether Merkel will sleepwalk into her fourth term, basically, in the upcoming elections. Well, we know the answer to that now. It's an obvious yes. Denzel Defoe replies to that, probably Germany is kaput and they deserve the hole they've got. It is the German voters who are sleepwalking. And Ryan says, unfortunately, it's likely Merkel will be re-elected. With this sickening Macron-Merkel neoliberal alliance, I look forward to Brexit more.
It is amazing that she wants to continue. 4 terms is a lot of terms for anyone.
It's going to be a second term with Herman Kohl, I think.
That is the first surprise. But the second surprise for me is that the SPD are in coalition with them. What kind of choice, therefore, do the German people have? Either the far left or the far right, or a centre party which basically contains everybody. Sorry, go on.
No, that's about right. About the Rohingyas, I would rather not go into that because I've got some surprising vile responses about that. There are actually people who are agreeing with this genocide. So let's not go into that.
Well, there's such anti-Muslim hatred out there that some idiots, and some educated idiots, their default position is to blame the Muslims, even when we can see on our television screens that they're being massacred and that they're defenseless. They don't even have bicycles to get away on.
Nothing. Well, that's all the time we've got for the tweets today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today, or on Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.